This class is part 2 of I taught 2 weeks ago as kind of an intro to Jewish agriculture that provided a bit of a framework for how I think about Shmita in the larger context of the Jewish agricultural code. And tonight we'll be getting into kind of some of the deeper implications of Shmita as envisioned or imagined by the rabbis and by ourselves in our kind of personal lives and in this contemporary moment. If you haven't had a chance to drop your name, pronoun, where you are, and the last wild or foraged food that you ate in the chat, please do so, and also take a look at who else is here. We have a nice group, and it's always fun to learn what kind of wild foods people have been getting down on recently. So we're going to start with a bit of a closed eye exercise. So I invite you to, if you're comfortable, you can close your eyes. If you want to turn off your camera momentarily, feel free. It's definitely great for folks to have their cameras on. It helps build a bit more sense of community through the screen. But for this moment, if you want to turn it off, that's totally fine. And I'm going to walk you through a short closed eye exercise. And this is something that if you might want to share at some point tonight, but you won't have to. So don't worry about that if that at all was might make you feel a bit uncomfortable. Okay, so close your eyes and take a moment to scan your relationships, your social sphere, your relationships with close friends, close family, co-workers, people who you are in touch with today, and also open up to folks who you might not have been in touch with for a long time. And think about a debt that you are holding on to, some feeling that someone owes you something. It could be an apology. It could be a phone call. It could be a gift. It could be money. But try to imagine that debt and consider the ways that as the debt holder, it's actually been weighing on you. Consider the ways that that debt is interfering in your ability to connect with this person, to be at ease with this person. What is preventing you from letting go of that debt? Are you waiting for the person to repay it? Have you maybe given up on that idea, but you still feel like it's owed to you? And what might allow you to release that debt? And it could be that you're not sure. It could be that you don't have that answer. So as you're ready and comfortable, you can open your eyes, reemerge in the present moment. And if your camera's off and you're able to turn it on, please do. And if not, that's also totally fine. So we all we all hold debts. We all hold on to things, feel like things are owed to us. And Shmita, the sabbatical year, one of its practices is the release of debt. And I don't think its original intention was to think about debt in kind of expansive ways. It's like quite literally forgiving financial debt. But I think that for me, that one of the things that's most exciting about Shmita is to think about how do we take some of these ideas, the specific practices, how do we distill out what these underlying values are, and how do we bring that into our lives in meaningful ways? Whether we're farmers or city dwellers, or farmers who live in the city, or not farmers at all, I think Shmita holds a lot of relevance and potential for us. And so tonight, we'll get to explore that a little bit. So I'm going to be doing some screen sharing tonight. I have a slideshow with some various pieces, and I'll probably be kind of jumping back and forth a little bit between that screen share. So I'll start us off right here. So we have some folks who were in class last week or 2 weeks ago, and then a bunch of folks who were not. So I want to do like a quick recap, but I want to open it up if there's anyone from 2 weeks ago who wanted to just share anything that's standing out to them from kind of some of the main takeaways from 2 weeks ago. And I think you should have the ability to just unmute yourself if you want to chime in, and also totally cool where I can just take over. So I'll get us started, and folks should feel free to raise their hand or just unmute and kind of jump in with questions or comments. But so the last class was this kind of intro to Jewish farming that over many years, as I was exploring Jewish agricultural traditions, I kind of developed this theory of Jewish agriculture. And it kind of starts with the earliest reference to agriculture in our tradition, which is from Breshit, from the book of Genesis, from the creation story and shortly after, which is Adam and Eve placed in the garden in kind of a stewardship role to work it and to protect it, but essentially to forage. There's an abundance of food. And God says to them, there's so much abundance here. You are welcome to it all. All I ask is that you show the tiniest bit of restraint and don't eat from this one tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And shortly after Adam and Eve arrive in the garden, as we probably are familiar with the story, they eat from that one tree and are booted out of the garden. And the punishment, consequence, however you want to think of it, is that they're now going to have to farm in order to feed themselves. That farming is kind of a curse. It's not the ideal way of existence that was part of the original design. So if you go through really the entire book of Breshit, but certainly the early chapters, one way of understanding this story is that this is kind of the mythology around the agricultural revolution, right? So roughly somewhere between 10 and 25,000 years ago, people started domesticating crops in that general part of the world. And essentially went from foragers, people who would wake up every day, essentially like all other animals, go out into the world and say, how am I going to feed myself today? What am I going to eat? I'm going to hunt, I'm going to forage, I'm going to gather, and then I'm going to be done, and I'll do it again tomorrow, and I'll do it the day after that. And that's how pretty much all animals operate, and that's how humans operated. For the vast majority of our existence on the planet, that's how humans have operated. We've only been farming for like a small percentage of our time on Earth. So one way of understanding the stories in Breshit is the story of the agricultural revolution. And so we then kind of went through what some of the implications of farming are. And anyone who was there and wants to jump in, feel free. I'll just kind of go through a few of the main ones. So farming leads to a division of labor and specialization, right? Farming allows a small percentage of the population to grow food for everyone else, and everyone else gets to do other things. Permanent settlement, we no longer have to be migratory and follow the seasons. We can actually just root in one place and we can grow an abundance of food and then stay there. That allows for populations to increase for several reasons. One is there's a perceived abundance of food. There's not a scarcity of resources, so we feel more comfortable with having more kids. There's also a lot of work on the farm to be done, and kids make good farm workers. And when you are migratory people, you actually want to limit how many kids you have, because you can only carry one kid on your hip at a time. And if you're going to be walking long distances regularly, you want to minimize the number of little kids that are running around. Wealth creation, right? As a hunter-gatherer, you're not really able to store much surplus. So you're really just out there each day trying to feed yourself. With farming, in a good year, you can grow a surplus, which is kind of the goal. So essentially, farming allows for wealth creation, the production of more than you need in the present moment, which is one way of defining wealth, which also leads directly to militarization, because once you have this surplus, well, who controls it? Who gets access to it? And whose job is it to protect that surplus, and who are they working for? So because of division of labor and specialization, you can have people whose dedicated role in the society is to protect that surplus. And then the question is, who are they protecting it for? So you start to see social and economic hierarchies emerge, and really the proliferation of culture and civilization. So the implications of farming are profound, but there's also some inherent injustices embedded within that, that come out of the wealth creation and the social and economic hierarchies that emerge, and the control of that surplus. Whoever controls that surplus has a tremendous amount of power, and we saw that in the story of Joseph in Egypt, when he predicts the 7 years of plenty followed by the 7 years of famine, and devises a plan to essentially tax all of the farmers and bring all of that surplus into the house of the Pharaoh. And then within 2 years of the famine striking, all of the people of Egypt and Canaan have come to the Pharaoh and essentially sold their land, sold their animals, and sold themselves into slavery in order to eat, because there's a famine and the Pharaoh has all of that surplus. So that's a bit of kind of like a warning shot, as I see it. And the Israelites are part of that. Joseph's family comes down from Canaan. They come to Egypt where there's food, and they settle in the land of Goshen. And an important thing to remember is that they are shepherds. They are not farmers. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob's children are all shepherds, not farmers. And it's only in this time in Egypt, over the course of several hundred years, that they are fully immersed and part of an oppressive agricultural society. And so that's really their exposure to being part of a wider agricultural society. And then when they leave Egypt, they have this 40-year period in the desert. And interestingly, during that 40-year period, they revert back to a foraging way of life, right? The manna that descends every day, the instructions are to go out, collect what you need for that day. If you take more than you need, it's going to spoil. It's not going to keep, except for on Fridays, you can take a double portion so that on Shabbat, you can still feed yourself. So there's this kind of reversion to a non-agricultural way of life that happens in the desert that I think of as kind of a cleansing of the palate. And then after 40 years of wandering, the Israelites are going to enter into the land, and this time they are going to become farmers. They are a much larger nation at this point, and they are going to become farmers. Most of the tribes are going to settle land and become farmers. And so the Jewish agricultural code, as I understand it, is really this preemptive attempt to address the injustices that are embedded in agricultural societies, right? And so through practices like Peah and Leket, leaving the corners of your field for those who don't have fields, leaving the gleanings for people who are hungry, donating your tithes to both the poor and also the priests. There's a separation of power here, where the priests, who in many agricultural societies kind of have access or control over the wealth and the surplus. In our tradition, the priests are the one tribe not allowed to own land, and so they also live off of the tithes, the maaser, the charity essentially from the farmers. And there's a whole slew of these laws that, in my mind, are really there to preemptively address the injustices that the Israelites saw firsthand in Egypt. And this is very explicit in the text, where it says over and over and over again, do not oppress the stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt, or having yourselves been slaves in the land of Egypt. And so the agricultural code is very much, it centers the needs of the most vulnerable people in the society. So Shabbat and Shmita and Yovel, so the weekly Shabbat, every 7 days, we have this day of rest. The Shmita year, every 7 years, we have a sabbatical year. And then after 7 cycles of 7 years, we have something called Yovel, the Jubilee year. These are, I kind of think of them as concentric circles, as like the pinnacle of this Jewish agricultural code. So Shabbat is this great equalizer, where in ancient times, you can imagine who actually had an opportunity to take a day off. It wasn't the poor, it was just the elite, the wealthy. Shabbat is a requirement for all people living in the community to observe, even if they're not Jewish. All animals get a Shabbat. You're not allowed to have animals work on Shabbat. So that's this great equalizer that happens on a weekly basis. And then every 7 years, we have this much more radical version of that, Shabbat Haaretz. It's the Shabbat for the land, where the land is given an opportunity to rest. And we enact a whole series of laws and practices around that. So I want to review what some of those are. So you can kind of break down the practices of the Shemitah year into agricultural and economic practices. So in general, and we could geek out and go into a lot more specifics about this, but that's not where I necessarily want to go tonight. So these will be kind of broad strokes. So in general, there's no agricultural activity, no plowing, no harvesting, no watering, no fertilizing, nothing that you would think of as kind of a general agricultural activity. All land that was privately owned for the previous 6 years, which in kind of Jewish tradition is a fiction anyway. But for the 6 years that we play this game where we get to pretend that we own land, in the 7th year, it becomes commons. Rich and poor have access to the same resources, and fences actually must even be opened or taken down. Not just so people can enter into your land, but even the animals. The animals, wild animals, need to have access to anything that's growing on your fields. All food that grows on its own is considered hefker, is ownerless, and it's available to anyone. So, right, so one of the first questions that people often ask about the Shemitah year is, well, what are people eating? If you're not growing food, then what are you eating? Well, there's a number of things that people could be eating in a Shemitah year. In reality, they would store up surplus from previous years of primarily grains, but perennials, so plants that grow on their own year after year that don't need to be planted every single year. That's all going to grow in the Shmita year. So fruit and nuts and berries, etc., and wild plants. So all of that grows in your farm, in the forest, it is all considered hefker and available to anyone, human or animal. And that food is not allowed to be exported. It has to be eaten in its place, in the region that it was harvested from. A few more agricultural laws or practices. All food that grows in the Shmita year has this special sanctity of the 7th year, and therefore certain restrictions apply to it. You have to harvest it when it's ripe. You can't harvest it and bring it into your house and then wait for it to ripen inside. It cannot be sold and has to be used in its most elevated form. So that's kind of like an interesting question, right? Something like olives, right? Which is definitely a staple commodity of the Middle East. What's its most ideal form? Is it olive oil or is it cured olives? I don't know if it comes down to personal preference or if there's kind of like a universal understanding of what is the preferred version, but that is one of the restrictions. Also, one of the interesting things about selling is that you're not allowed to sell any of that Shmita harvest in kind of a formal commercial way, but you are allowed to sell it like informally. But the rules around that are really interesting. You have to just estimate how much it's worth. So you take this, like, I've got a few oranges, why don't you give me like $3 for them, right? It becomes very informal, no weighing and measuring. Barter is embraced, right? You might just trade for it. But if you do sell it, it has to be done informally, which is interesting in its own right, but also because it stands in stark contrast to another principle that we see in the Torah, which is that you have to have accurate measures and scales. That when you are selling things in the market, you are required to have accurate measures and scales so that you're giving people a fair and accurate price. But in the Shmita year, like, all that goes away and we just kind of like, becomes much more informal. It's a much more informal kind of economy. And eating local. So only fresh crops that are actively growing in your region can be consumed. So take, for example, if you've ever grown tomatoes, they often volunteer the next year, right? You've got plenty of tomatoes that fall to the ground and the seeds hit the soil and they hang out there for the winter, and then come spring, they start growing on their own. So you could definitely have tomatoes during a Shmita year. Well, you've got some tomatoes, you grab a few for your own personal use, you bring them inside, and that night there's a hard frost and all of the tomato plants die. You are no longer allowed to eat those tomatoes that you brought in because they are no longer growing out in the fields, right? So again, this is all part of this notion that we're like reverting to a non-agricultural way of feeding ourselves, right? We are returning to a form of foraging. And so if it's not available outside, then we're not allowed to eat it, with the exception of things we had stored from previous years. But anything that is growing actively, we're not allowed to eat it once it's no longer growing out in the field. Scott, yeah.
Hi, Nati, good evening. Just a technical question. You got all these volunteer tomatoes during the Shmita year. Would it be a violation to cultivate them and say, oh, there's too many of them, I'm going to take out 20 and just are you starting to cultivate there?
My understanding is that would be a violation. You're not allowed to do anything, right? So you just kind of let it do its thing. And if it produces food, great. And if not, move on to something else. But yeah, in fact, there's even some restrictions around Shmita practices that go into effect several months before Rosh Hashanah, before the new year kicks in. Like you're spreading compost on your field in August in advance of Rosh Hashanah. You might think, okay, well, let me get the compost down to fertilize the fields,
Right.
before the Shemitah year kicks in. If it is something that would benefit the land during Shemitah, you're not permitted to do it. And on the flip side, as I understand it, there are certain things that you can actually start doing towards the end of the Shemitah year,
sure,
because they are preparation for the following year, and you're not
plans a
actually
cover crop or whatever.
Yeah. So there might be certain things like that. Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay, so some of the economic practices of the Shemitah year. So this is what I was saying earlier. Shemitah produce cannot be sold, and it can be sold in small quantities informally, but can only be sold by estimate. Certain agricultural tools cannot be sold to someone in the Shemitah year for fear that they will violate Shemitah. And debt release. Debt release is one of the core economic components of Shemitah. And it's essentially the practice goes like this. At the end of the Shemitah year, so this doesn't kick in at the very beginning, it happens at the end of the Shemitah year. Any debt that is still withstanding is canceled, debt from person to person. And a few important things to note about the nature of that debt. So first of all, we have the practice in our tradition that we don't charge interest to each other. Jews do not charge interest to other Jews. So any loans that were being made in the first place are not, there's no industry of loan making happening, right? Any loan that is being made is really being made as an act of goodwill. You're trying to help someone out who's struggling. Now, I just learned this like a year or so ago, why the debt release happens at the end of the Shemitah year and not at the beginning. I always thought it was at the beginning, and then I learned that it was actually at the end of the Shemitah year. Anyone have any ideas why that might be the case? So farmers are often borrowing money at the beginning of the season, right? The whole CSA model, the community supported agriculture model, essentially emerges to replace the need for farmers to borrow money at the beginning of the season. At the beginning of a season, a farmer has a lot of costs, and they're not going to replenish those costs until several months later when they start selling their harvests. So it's actually quite common and normal and healthy for farmers to take on some amount of debt at the beginning of the season. So the debt that gets canceled from the Shemitah year is not the normal regular debt that a farmer might incur at the beginning of the season that they're then going to pay back at the end of the season once they sell their harvest. It's the debt that after a full year of cessation from agricultural activity is still there, right? It's the debt that you're not able to pay off. So that's the debt that gets canceled. And the idea behind this is that it's preventing the person who is in debt from going deeper into debt. It provides a pressure release valve for an economic pressure release valve. Similarly to what, in contemporary times, declaring bankruptcy does, right? That we have this practice in our economic system that allows for individuals and businesses to at some point say, you know what, we're just gonna, we need all of our debt canceled and we need an opportunity to start over. And I'm pretty sure that on a personal level, if you declare bankruptcy, it stays on your credit record for 7 years. And I'm not sure if that's just a coincidence or if someone was kind of taking some inspiration from this biblical practice when they devised that law. And then in addition to debt release, there's also the practice of the releasing of slaves. Now, this is something that gets mentioned in the Torah right alongside debt release, but the Shemitah year is the same for everyone, right? This coming Rosh Hashanah marks the next Shemitah year, and everyone around the world is kind of experiencing Shemitah in the same year. The release of slaves happens on its own independent 7-year cycle. So if you know, we can think of slaves in this context kind of more as indentured servants, people who are working off debt. And the standard term for that is 6 years, and then in the 7th year you're released. But that happens kind of in a vacuum. It doesn't matter where in the Shmita cycle someone enters into that arrangement. But it's clearly connected because it follows the same amount of time, and it's referenced very close to other practices of the Shmita year. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment. And I wanted to just provide a framing for all of these for all of these practices. One way of thinking about these various practices of Shmita is that they essentially address the stages into poverty that someone might follow in an agricultural society. So if you are a farmer, but you're struggling, you're not a very good farmer, and you're having trouble kind of earning enough. So one of the first things you might do is borrow money. But that doesn't change the fact that you're not a very good farmer. And so a year later, you've borrowed some money, but you're still struggling. And so then you think, you know what? I should probably just sell my land, cash out, and maybe try to do something else. So you sell your land and you cash out, but even then you're still struggling and you still owe this money. And so you might enter into an arrangement of indentured servitude to try to work off that debt because you don't have any other options. So Shmita kind of addresses each of those stages. So first of all, it forgives debt. It then, at least for the Shmita year, makes all land equally accessible by the rich and the poor. And finally, it, again, not on the Shmita year, but connected to the cycle, releasing of slaves. Right, so Shmita is much more than kind of a simple agricultural practice of just letting the land rest for a year and picking right back up. It's actually a much more robust economic policy, one that has agricultural implications because it emerges from an agricultural society where the vast majority of people were farmers, but it's not often. It's just thought of as this, oh, let's let the land lay fallow for a year and then we'll pick back up. Additionally, when you think about the how the agricultural implications of Shmita, they're also much more profound. It's great that in the year leading up to Shmita, we're starting to see more and more Shmita programming. And one of the key lessons that, as I've been kind of preaching the Shmita gospel for 2 decades now, one of the main things we try to reiterate is that you can't wait till the 6th year to plan for Shmita. You actually have to plan all 6 years leading up to Shmita. It's a 6-in-1 cycle. It's not a 1 year out of 7. It's actually a 7-year cycle, and each of the 6 years has different components to it, different aspects of preparation. It's kind of like if you decided 4:30 on Friday afternoon that you wanted to keep Shabbat, but you hadn't done any preparation for it. You could probably do it. You could probably get away with it, but it might not be the most enjoyable. And what we see in modern times, because the agricultural aspects of Shmita only apply in the biblical land of Israel, which doesn't even fully map onto the modern state of Israel. So there's parts of the modern state of Israel that are not subject to the agricultural laws of Shmita. The economic aspects of Shmita apply all over the world. But so every 7 years in Israel, they have to kind of figure this out. And often it feels like that's what's happening, is that they're waiting till halfway through the 6th year to kind of really start to think about it. And as being, a modern nation state that's part of a global food system and a global economy, it's quite difficult to fully enact Shmita the way I think it was originally envisioned and intended. Because in order to do so from an agricultural perspective, you would probably grow a lot more perennials than annuals, which if you think about the 7 sacred species of ancient Israel, 5 of them are perennials and 2 of them are annuals. So you would, but in our modern diets, we eat way more annuals than perennials. So you would have to reorient your agricultural system accordingly. And you would need a robust system of storing surplus in the lead up to that year. And figuring out ways in this modern context to allow for people to take a year off and still have enough food and still be able to pay the bills. Which is why it's really, I think, important to be thinking about Shmita and orienting towards Shmita every year, not just in the 5th or 6th year. Also, we have one of our agricultural laws, Orla, forbids us from harvesting fruit from a fruit tree, or really a perennial, for the first 3 years that it's growing, right? So if you want to have an abundant supply of perennials in your Shmita year, you got to get those trees in the ground in the 1st or 2nd year to really allow them to grow and mature and be producing enough before the Shmita year hits. All right. Before we, Jesse, I don't know if this is going to mess things up. If I change my view to gallery, is that going to change the spotlight for other people? I just would like to see as many folks as I can.
That's all good.
Okay, great. And I love, I like Sue's comment in the chat that the National Young Farmers Association calls you a young farmer till you farmed for 7 years. I've also heard this idea that that you become native to a place when you've been there for 7 generations, which, as someone, I mean, that's pretty hard for me. I don't know what other people's kind of family stories are. It's pretty hard for me to imagine that. Just, I am the child of immigrants and grandchild of immigrants, and there's been a lot of movement in my family. So to imagine being in the same place for 7 generations is a bit mind-blowing. Okay, so before I move on, I want to just pause and see if anyone has any questions or comments. Yes, Sue, I can definitely share the link to the slides after the class. I'll give it to Jesse at Urban Adamah, and I think he'll be able to send that out. Yes, Scott.
Was Jacob an indentured servant, or was he some other classification to Laban?
Yeah, so he's right. He goes through 2 cycles of 7 years, right? So
Right.
when he's kind of trying to, I don't know if it's not really working off debt. It's more his like corrupt father-in-law.
Right, Laban. Don't trust Laban.
Yeah.
Tricky uncle.
But it's interesting. I mean, that predates any of these ideas in any of these.
Oh, because the Torah wasn't given, or?
Yeah, I mean, depending on how you understand kind of the stories in the Torah, but chronologically,
Right.
at least, that predates any notion of Shabbat or Shmita. But it is interesting that, yes, in the Jacob story, he has these 2 7-year terms of servitude, essentially, in order.
Yeah, I'll have to read it again. The last time I read it, it wasn't clear whether he served for 12 years or 14 years, or
I think it's
14, just
14.
one term. 14, was it 14? Okay.
I think so, but I might not be right.
Yeah. We'll read it again soon.
Yeah, that's right. It's coming up shortly. Okay, great. So let me get back to this. If you're not familiar with Chazon's Shmita source book, which came out right around the last Shmita year, I highly recommend it. It looks like this. You can access it on the Chazon website, I believe, for free download. It is it's really phenomenal. It was compiled in large part by a good friend of mine, Yigal Deutscher. And it has really like all of the biblical texts, a lot of rabbinic texts, and then a whole kind of exploration about what Shmita means in a contemporary context. But so he, in the book, he does a great job of kind of bundling the Shmita practices into these kind of 13 different principles. And then he breaks them up into different kind of categories. So you have a sabbatical food system around land stewardship and perennial harvest, full ripeness, a seasonal diet, and eating local. You have community and food security. So creating commons, communal access to all food, fair distribution. When you harvest, you can only collect for your immediate needs and not beyond. A land ethic, that the land is not property to be sold, and sacred harvest, that the food growing in the Shemitah year has this sanctity. And then finally, the community and economic resiliency. So a decommercialization process where food is no longer a commodity, right? Food is something sacred and cannot be sold for the sake of profit, but it can be shared. Debt release and a gift economy. And I just love the way that Yigal was able to kind of like capture the essence of all these different practices in this kind of cohesive list, that very quickly you can see how that starts to generate ideas of what that might mean for us in a contemporary context. So I wanted to run through a few rabbinic texts that come from just the last few hundred years around Shemitah. And what's kind of interesting about some of these texts is that these are people who were generally not living in the land of Israel. And the notion of living in the land of Israel was for some of them at least, was pretty far off, was not something that they had to think about as a real possibility. And so what you see in some of this rabbinic language is this, they're able to embrace Shemitah in kind of the most idyllic terms. They're not like worried about, well, how is this actually going to work? How do we actually make this work? How do we feed ourselves? How do we set up economic systems that will make this work? They can think and talk about Shemitah in pretty lofty terms, which I like. So the Kli Yakar from the 17th century, commentating on a passage from Deuteronomy about Shemitah, says, "The year of Shemitah promotes a sense of fellowship and peace, for one is not allowed to exercise over any of the seventh year produce the right of private ownership. And this is undoubtedly a primary factor in promoting peace, since most dissension originates from the attitudes of mine is mine, one person claiming it is all mine and the other also claiming it is all mine. But in the seventh year, all are equal, and this is the real essence of peace." Rabbi Tzvi Kalisher in the early 19th century writes that the Shemitah year teaches us further that the rich should not lord it over the poor. Accordingly, the Torah ordained that all should be equal during the seventh year, both the rich and the needy having access to the gardens and fields to eat their fill. So to me, this is like a powerful image, right? So much of the social and economic hierarchy in our contemporary society is designed to keep classes of people apart, right? That their interactions are limited to certain types of interactions. But imagine for a second what it would be like if 1 year out of 7, the richest people and the poorest people ate at the same table and shared food together. How might that transform the relationships between these classes? How might that transform the underlying motivation that some people have toward accumulating and hoarding wealth, right? When they actually build relationships, true relationships with people who are struggling, how might that change their priorities or their behavior in the other 6 years? I think decommercialization is such an important idea in our world today. And you hear people talk about certain things as rights, not privileges, right? Water is a human right, food is a human right, healthcare is a human right. These are not privileges, but these are rights that people have. And when they're rights, then we have to decommercialize them, decommodify them. I teach a course at Temple University on sustainable food systems. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is one of the kind of the underlying, one of the root causes of our unsustainable and unjust food system is that we treat food like a commodity, like any other thing. So when we think about how it's produced, we strive for efficiency and profit margin. And what that leads to is an incredibly complex and in many ways effective global food system, right? It's like astonishing that I can go to the market near my house, I can get produce that was grown on the other side of the world and was shipped here, and it's ripe and ready for me to go. But it also means that the tomato that I eat from that flew 6,000 miles to get here tastes very different than the tomato that's growing in my garden, because it wasn't bred for, selected for taste and flavor. It was bred for and selected for profit and its ability to thrive in a global industrial food system. But if we have a food system that once every 7 years, food cannot be exported, food is not sold, food has a special sacredness to it, there's something really profound about that. And Rav Kook, who's an interesting character around Shmita, because he was the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Palestine, kind of pre-48. And as more Jewish farmers were starting to move to Palestine, this issue of Shmita comes up. And they say, what are we going to do? We're struggling. There's no way we can actually keep Shmita. Like, we're just not set up for that. We're just barely scraping by. And so he writes this text called Shabbat Haaretz, all about Shmita. And the introduction is kind of similar to some of that other rabbinic language. It's all this beautiful, lofty language around Shmita. And then the second half of it is like a very dense, technical, legal document giving these loopholes about how to kind of avoid practicing Shmita. And when he first creates that legal loophole, he imagines that it'll just be for that one Shmita year. And by the time the next Shmita year comes around, we'll have figured it out and we can really keep Shmita. Well, it's still being practiced today. But so in that introduction to Shabbat Haaretz, he writes, sanctity is not profaned by the exercise of private acquisitiveness over all this year's produce, and the covetousness of wealth stirred up by commerce is forgotten, for food, but not for commerce, right? That there's this kind of like power in not treating food like a commodity. Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer in the 19th century talks about Shmita as an opportunity for liberation from materialism. That yet another reason for Shmita is that they should not always be preoccupied with working the soil to provide for their material needs. For in this 1 year, they would be completely free. The liberation from the yoke of work would give them the opportunity for studying Torah and wisdom, and that the illiterate will be occupied with crafts and building and supply these needs in Eretz Yisrael. Those endowed with special skills will invent new methods in this free time for the benefit of the world. I just love this idea, right? I mean, we see it today. We see this kind of this one manifestation of this one real manifestation of Shmita in our contemporary society is the practice of the sabbatical, right? That is alive in the academic world and is alive in certain businesses and organizations. I've noticed that in the Jewish nonprofit sector, there's been an attempt to really embrace the idea of sabbaticals, but it's never a full year. It's usually like, oh, I'm going on a 1 month sabbatical or a 2 month sabbatical, which is nice. It's like a nice gesture. but like, what would it look like for us to really embrace Shmita, where, you know, my dad was a math professor, so every 7 years he got a sabbatical, and he loved it. You know, he wrote a book about calculus in one, and but there was this freedom for him that that he experienced that I think is kind of captured here, right? That like when there's a year of just letting go and not feeling obligated to work, that you know, you can delve into studying Torah, or you can like pick up a new craft, right? How many people do you know who like in their retirement discovered that they love painting and they become like avid painters or something like that, right? That like our society is so work focused that we often we don't have the opportunity to really embrace other parts of who we are. So imagine, instead of waiting till you retire to do that, if every 7 years you had a chance to do that. And there are some like pretty progressive businesses and organizations that are embracing this. I saw a TED talk by a guy who runs a design firm that every 7 years the whole firm just shuts down for the year, and everyone has a fully paid year off. And what he found, at least as he described it in his TED talk, was that when they come back, they actually generate like more business and have better ideas, and everyone comes back like refreshed and inspired and ready to go. That there's something kind of profoundly positive and impactful about that year. And finally, on this issue of debt, Rav Kook says that the 7th year serves to rectify the social ills and inequalities that accumulate in society over the years. When poorer segments of society borrow from the wealthy, they feel beholden to the affluent elite. The debtor is a servant of the lender, as it says in Proverbs. This form of subservience can corrupt even honest individuals in their dealings with the rich and powerful. The sabbatical year comes to correct the situation of inequality and societal rifts by removing a major source of power of the elite, debts owed to them, right? And we see this, you see this on personal levels, people who live with a lot of debt and the crushing feeling of that. You see that on a global level, right? And in fact, around the year 2000, there was the global Jubilee movement, which was using the language of Shmita and Yovel, Shmita and Sabbatical year and the Jubilee year, to encourage the cancellation of debt that developed nations were holding over developing nations, right? You had models where developing nations were spending more on the interest payments on the debt that they owed than they were able to spend on building their own infrastructure or schooling or healthcare. That's not a good recipe for anyone. So what Shmita teaches us, is that actually every 7 years we need to like release that debt. I forget if I used this analogy in the last class, so forgive me if I did, but I think a lot about this in the context of the game of Monopoly, right? We've all probably played Monopoly. You know, it lasts an hour to maybe 3, often ends with some sort of like family feud. But you know, you play the game, and at the end of the game, one person has all the money and all the property, and everyone else is bankrupt and in debt, or maybe in jail. And that's like great for a board game, but that's not the recipe that we want for our society, for our economic system. And in fact, some people might know this, but Monopoly was developed by a socialist to teach about the evils of capitalism. And then in classic capitalist form, capitalism was like, oh, this is a great game. Let's commercialize this and make it a fun game to teach people about all the good things about capitalism. And so I think that the kind of the Shmita values of debt forgiveness are profound and a reminder of what our priorities should be, our collective priorities. And we'll get back to this a little bit at the end, but I think there's real, you know, I think now we live in a society where there is a whole industry around loan making, right? So, I mean, maybe in families or close friends, sometimes people want to borrow some money, but like most of, like, right now, I don't think I'm like holding any debt. I don't owe any individual that I have a relationship with money, and I don't think anyone owes me money. It's less common, but I think that there's a profound potential in embracing this idea for non-monetary debts, right? We all hold a lot of debts, personal debts over other people. And we might feel indebted to other people in certain ways, and that is often not a good feeling. Lisa, I see you have your hand raised. Did you want to share something?
Yeah, hi, Nati. I got very uncomfortable speaking with Minerva and Marie about how does it feel the year after the Shmita year when you turn away the poor and you don't let them eat anymore. That must be horrible.
It's a great question. So, you know, in the first time that Shmita is mentioned in the Torah, it says that you should let the land rest so that the poor among your people will eat, which, you know, I think points to it being this kind of wider economic policy and not just an agricultural policy. But it does beg the question, like, well, what are they doing for the other 6 years, right? You can't just live on eating food 1 year out of 7. So I think there's a couple of things going on. First of all, in every other year, we have this robust system of a social safety net, leaving the corners of the field, donating 10% of your harvests, leaving the gleanings and the forgotten harvests in the field. So you already have this kind of mechanism of protecting or ensuring that their needs are being met on a regular basis. And then the way I think about it is that, you know, a society that's really enacting these Shmita practices will fundamentally change the relationships. So while in the other 6 years, the land does become private and there is ownership and you can sell food, I believe that if the society was really embracing Shmita in the deepest and truest way, that there would be less inequality and there would be more concern for the poor. Maybe that's, again, I haven't had to like grapple with like actually making this policy and making this work for large numbers of people. So maybe it's a little naive or idealistic, but I really do believe that. But I know it's unnerving to think about, right? But again, the way that one other way, going back to that monopoly analogy, is that we're playing this game, right? If you think about it, I like to think of it that like we're all LARPing. We're all engaged in this massive live action role play. And farming is one of the things that allows that to happen, because without it, we would all be hunting and gathering every day. So we're all LARPing. And the goal of the game is to just like have it never end. That's the goal. And so we take these steps to prevent it from getting to a point where it has to end, right? By the end of that game of Monopoly, like you're ready for it to be over because you hate your uncle and like he snagged those properties from you and you just want this game to end. Well, like the blueprint in our tradition is one for sustainability, I believe, which means that it can just keep going. And so, you know, at the end of 7 years, all the debt's released, and so that is a poverty reduction measure. At the end of 49 years in the Jubilee, actually, all the property cards get thrown back into the mix, into the center, and then redistributed equitably. That's what happens in the Jubilee year. And so that's like the giant reset that happens once in a person's lifetime or so. And it prevents kind of generational poverty and generational wealth from being concentrated. That's how I think about it.
I actually had a question about Jubilee. Is Jubilee based on a person's life, or is it based on a calendar?
Yeah, so similar to Shmita, the Jubilee year is the same for everyone. Although I've heard that we somehow like don't know exactly, like even though we know what year is the Shmita year, somehow we don't know which
which of the 7?
Where the 50th year is in that cycle. So, but at the same time, Jubilee only applies when the majority of Jews are living in the land of Israel, which I think is not the case right now, but like it's trending in that direction. So at some point in the next chunk of time, there's going to be people there who take this stuff very seriously from a legal perspective, who are going to have to figure out what to do about it. And I think there are people who are already like working on that. So I wanted to, so we're going to wrap quickly, and I'm also happy to hang for another 15 minutes or so. So I know the program is supposed to end right around now. So if people need to jump off, that's totally fine. But I'm also happy to kind of keep going informally, but I do want to just kind of close with a one last screen share. Going back to this idea that like life in the Garden of Eden is maybe the original design. I once saw a bumper sticker that said God's original plan was to hang out in a garden with some naked vegetarians. And so if that's like the original design, and farming is kind of like the consequence of our inability to show the tiniest bit of restraint, Shmita is an opportunity to get a glimpse back into what is possible. And so this text says, "And the wolf shall lie down with the sheep. This was how it was already in the time of Adam at the beginning of creation." And we also know that very clearly that the earth is now cursed with thorns and thistles. And that's the language from Genesis. When Adam gets kicked out, it says that thorns and thistles will grow in the ground, whereas it never used to be. And animals never used to tear each other up for food, because in the Garden of Eden, apparently all the animals were vegan also. So as a reminder of the past and to serve as inspiration for the future, the Almighty has commanded the mitzvah of the Shmita year, which draws our attention to the time of the creation and the time of the coming Messiah. "And for your cattle and for the beast which is in your land shall all the produce be to eat." It is in fact kind of a promise, that is to say, if you do all of this, the time will come when cattle and beasts will eat together. For their abandoning everything in the year of the Shmita to the cattle and the beasts is a sign of what was and will be again. For no longer will they eat bread by the sweat of their brow, and the wild animals will not harm the cattle. So therefore, whoever observes the mitzvot, which signify this, will be privileged to experience all these great things.
Nice.
So I just want, as we, I guess, have about 11 months, 10 or 11 months until the Shmita year arrives, for us to be thinking about the potential that exists in this year to kind of transcend commercialism and the commodification of things that we know are sacred and crucial. And on a personal level, to really sit with this idea of what are the debts that we're holding, and what might it look like for us to release the debts, right? Like the word Shmita literally means release. So what would it look like for us to embrace this idea of release on a very personal level? And what do we have to do between now and Rosh Hashanah to do that kind of preparation? And so these are the questions that I invite us to sit with as we wrap up tonight, and as we consider these next 10 months and the work that lies ahead of us. And to remember, I think, even amidst these strange and heavy days that we're immersed in right now. That there is this possibility, there is this vision, there is this idea that we can get a taste of a different way, and that there's work that we can be doing to prepare for that. So with that, I want to wrap, and thank you for participating this evening and joining us. And again, I'm totally happy to hang for another 10, 15 minutes if folks want to linger and have questions or comments or anything like that. And if folks need to jump off, that's obviously totally okay. So thank you.
Nati,